I think everyone is here now, trying to connect. We are connected. We are all connected, and we are all here for a very special presentation. At least I would happen to agree. It's my presentation. I have to say it's special. Legally obligated to. Anyway, welcome! Welcome to Gameu, and look into lesser known but important Japanese games and creators. Where to begin? Wow. Let's do some introductions before we get too deep into the woods. Let's start by introducing some of the characters of our lovely story here. On top left, Rika Suzuki. Next to her, Kure Eiji. Next to him, Kotori Yoshimura. And at the top right area, Tada. At bottom left, these are all people we'll be going over as we go through the presentation. We have Yuichi Toyama. Next after that, Yoshio Kiya, who we just saw right at the end of that video, I believe on the left in his office outfit. That's a little comic drawing of the developer Tinyan, like tiny cat Tinyan. Tokihiro Naoto right next to her. At the end, Sapporo Momoko. Go. Yeah, who are they? What's this about? Anyway, so you know the big names. You know Kojima, Miyamoto, Sueri, Suda. They are ringing around in the gaming discourse at this very moment, and that's all good. This isn't a panel to say they're not cool anymore because they're known. This is the panel to say because these people are relatively unknown, at least out in the Anglosphere here, they should get more appreciation. And I'm going to go to bat for why that is absolutely the case. They all come either from the 80s or from the early 90s in this panel. Some did have proteges who would work up through to now. Some actually got their start at the turn of the 80s or even in the 70s. But mostly, we're talking about 80s creators who had a big impact, even in a small space, and on a very overlooked part of Japanese game history, which involves Japanese microcomputers, home computers. We'll be going into more depth about that in the next slide. And of course, preservation is very important. I'm presenting this panel, we should go through the introductions now, because we're on the right. We are both members of the Geofront. I am Pascal Deacon.
I'm Font Master.
And together with the Game Preservation Society in Tokyo, I forgot the nervousness, we are presenting this panel. The Game Preservation Society is a nonprofit organization with a government grant to collect, preserve, and properly contextualize many games-related media artifacts and the stories of its developers, with a heavy focus currently on Japanese PC games.
Yep.
That's kind of in a nutshell. There's a missing part of the trifecta that I see in a lot of games discussion, old game appreciation, and general history of this medium, which is the PC. You don't think of it normally. You think of consoles or arcade cabinets. They're very important, of course. Those are communal spaces with a lot of history. What's the PC got to do with this? Why don't you hear much discussion about home computers or even computers in the workspace? They all played games. They played other software, but we're here for games, especially. And at the bottom, you see Satoru Iwata from his early days at HAL Laboratory. As a young kid going into high school, he got into calculators, then terminal computers, and then finally, going past just what was available at school, his own home computer, getting him into programming. This development from just doing it as a hobby on your own, making your own games, sharing them with your friends, and then going to larger companies and even larger corporations to make larger projects is something we'll be seeing throughout the panel. However, according to himself, his own family was skeptical that this was a viable career path. And it turned out, with enough determination, he could make it work. And of course, this was the case for many developers, like Tokihiro Naoto on the top left, and Rika Suzuki at the very right on that picture. You have this development from bedroom coders to cubicle coders. And the same goes for artists, musicians, designers, and planners. And even the less glamorous but still important people working in business and marketing. Of course, if you wanted to get your news about your game out in the first place, you had to go to the press. Magazines like Technopolis, an issue is shown right here, Login, Comptic, Baymaga, or MyCom Basic, they let you play type-in listing games on home if it's basic or you have to type in the hex yourself, it's a lot to do. And during all this, there was an economic windfall, the famous Japanese bubble economy of the 80s. We'll see that over time, the eventual collapse of this bubble does eventually lead to many of these developers' ambitions being curtailed. They have to find work in places they may not have expected or wanted to go to. Until then, you could go to your local BBS network on your phone line and share some cool things you're working on. Our first creator we're talking about is Yuichi Toyama. He had a long career starting in the early 80s, rather in the mid 80s, but in the early 80s when he started working on his own games, like Vilzom in the bottom left, that led him to a career at Technosoft. This was the earliest days of Technosoft after they reorganized in 82. This company out in Sasebo had a number of powerful and talented coders and designers of their own, and Toyama made his mark with Herzog. Who here has played Herzog Spy? Raise your hands if you have. Awesome, there's a few lucky people who know, they know. And Herzog was the foundation. You could play it on MSX, and wow, there is an RDS and shooting game hybrid right at your home on your keyboard. And it didn't seem that crazy at the time, but this has had ramifications, as we'll see with another creator later on. He had a longer career at Compile, working on great shooting games like Musha Aleste? I never could figure it out. I'm sorry. And producing games like the Kurin series, the first GBA release of that series, he had a big managing role in that game's development. But that's at 18, that's my mistake. 18, or Rising as it was first known, produced many classic shooter games in the arcades, not just for consoles. Games like Sokugi Rentai, Kurin, as we mentioned, and also many great anime fighting games over the years, especially in series like Bleach. So that is quite a lot to go through. It's a long discography if we're talking in musician terms. What makes Toyama's work so special is a mix of his own personal experience with arcade games that he grew up with, such as Space Invaders, and how he synthesized his own ideas and experience with those of his teammates. At Technosoft, you get a more clear, the Technosoft games he made have a more clear showing of what was interesting to him, more unique, one might say gimmicky, but still well fleshed out idea mechanics in games like Herzog, where you're both fighting as yourself in your own mecha, or you're directing troops around the battlefield, producing them, getting them to go out and fight the other enemy. And it's usually one side to the next. Today, in today's MOBAs, such as League of Legends, for example, you have this idea of lanes. And this idea, in its roughest form, even existed in something like Herzog, where you would have to constantly manage between your own combat and the combat of your inferiors, essentially. So a big part of this panel is demonstrating all the hidden stories that are behind these creators. And that leads to these various things right here. We have a few more examples of Technosoft, then Rising, and then finally work he's done with others on Mega Drive Mini, and now the Mini 2 as well. He also helped, at Taito, where he now works, he helped produce collections like the Space Invaders Infinity Collection. And if we go over here, we do have a video. It should play. We'll just go to a little snippet, 1 minute left in. Put on subtitles. These are full-blown, high-quality documentaries produced by the Game Preservation Society. They are on YouTube. I highly recommend you check them out. Raise the volume a bit. Oh, sorry. レンタのスペースインベーダー初めて見たと思うんですね、純正の紫筐体で、なんかそれが衝撃的で、そこからちょっとそれが遊びたいっていう形で、思い始めるようになりました。そうですね、隣のブロックスペースインベーダーが最初の出会いだと思います。でしようっていうような状態だと思うんですよね。僕らだけ入社が決まっている人間がこう何人もいましたから。で、そこに行って、
でそれをしたら終わりです。よしさん OK です。それで大体わかります。そうですね、終わりさっていうか、ソフトのゲームを知ってたのは当時はプラズマラインとか。
That's just a little peek at that excellent 30-minute documentary about Yuichi Toyama. I don't need full screen. Let's go back. Very good. Whoa, whoa, whoa. That's a slide too far. Let me get out of this, then back in. There we go. Another great example on the other end, going away from action games, of which Toyama was a particularly talented individual, we have Rika Suzuki, who got her start with her own company, Riverhill Soft, in the 80s and 90s, before transitioning to a newer, smaller unit called Sing. Who here has played Hotel Dusk, or Another Code, or In Trace Memory? Excellent, I see a few hands right here. That probably is your main exposure to her writing, something that she cultivated over years of reading mystery and pulp fiction and watching various films. She had an initial corporate career working in Fukuoka on Kyushu. However, this was stifling, and she got very interested in computer programming in the early 80s, thanks to publications making it seem really cool and popular and doable. So with her fellow friends, she started Riverhill Soft and started making adventure games like this one right here, Werewolf Murder Case on the left. The fellow is not looking very good. And then eventually, once you reach the 90s, the turn of the 90s even, in 1990, you have games such as the Total Ryunosuke murder mysteries set in Taisho, Japan. We have much higher production values. And how did it get here? In the first place, there was a demand for more murder mystery type adventures. Who here has heard of Portopia Serial Murder Case? Another few hands here. I'm not covering Yuji Horii. Yuji Horii of Dragon Quest fame is pretty well known, but not a dig. But Rika Suzuki was just as much an effective peer. And her own adventures, particularly those in the J.B. Harold series, had a major influence on the kinds of adventure games leading to what you have today with Phoenix Wright and Danganronpa. And you even have some experiments, such as in this game, the Golden Compass. You have to actually manually go around the cruise ship you're on going home to Japan, and talk to everyone, and you have to manage your time and etc., which is very interesting. You get with the more modern games she worked on at Sing, Hotel Dusk, and Another Code, you have the integration of interesting presentation techniques using the flip screen, the dual screens, for instance, or motion controls to simulate the procedural actions that make it feel more real to actually do detective work. She now works at Bellwood as a consultant on various games. We have Dr. Hauser on the left as an example of the kinds of games that she helped produce in her own managerial aspect. This would lead to level 5, as some of you might know. Aki Hiroshino programmed that game and got the idea to make more blockbusters in that vein. That's not a dig. And Glass Rose is an interesting example. You might not think that was their first game as Sing, but it was. And you can still play the J.B. Harold games. You can get Manhattan Requiem for iOS and Android in English. It's not a great translation, localization. It does work. It works enough. And we have another GPS documentary. I wonder if it takes some support to make these documentaries. Let's go here.
ゲーム制作をしていて、もちろんその当時のゲームってやっぱり16歳の高校生あたりの人が喜ぶもっと知らたこと言葉の中で間違ってるかもしれませんけども、怪獣的なものと戦隊シリーズでそういう非常にランキング的なものが多かったり、あとは非常にアクション性が強かったり。プレイヤーのスキルを要求するゲームが多かった印象があります。私は自分が決してプレイヤーがないわけでもないんですけれども、ゲームの世界に浸るということがとても楽しいことですね。そういう世界観ですとか、キャラクター性というものを強く打ち出して分かりやすく残るので、映画のような感覚、ドラマを見たような感覚があるゲームっていうのは作れないと思っておりまして、
A little bit of her philosophy on media in general right there. Is it going to be Bing? Thank you, voiceover. My voiceover. Not my voice. A different one. Speaking of adventure games, speaking of games in general, have you ever played a block puzzle in Zelda and wondered, has this always been here? Why is this, it's almost like an archetype, like it's existed since the start of humanity. No, it hasn't. You might think that, but it started in 82. 1982 is when Hiroyuki Imebayashi, a hapless little record store worker in Takarazuka, Japan, made a game called Sokoban. Sokoban, he actually made the cartridge, he would dub the cartridges on tape, the tapes, not the cartridges, package them, do the shipping and selling himself. He was committed very hard to that idea, as he revealed in an interview that has been translated recently by Shmuplations, which you should check out. And after Sokoban became kind of a cult success that then blossomed into a big success thanks to ports to various consoles and even early portables like the Epoch Pocket game computer, which we'll get to in a second, this was the fuel to start making games that he also really cared about. And he loved adventures. He loved film, and he loved music, and he loved putting them together into really interesting mysteries. Which you get, for example, with The Man I Love here at the top left, the top right, with its funny little character right here. He also cared a lot about his presentation, the art of his favorite artist, Akira Komeda, who did the character art not just for his adventure games, but for many by Riverhill Soft, who this company, Thinking Rabbit, would partner with at various points, really gives a kind of detail and depth to the world that he's presenting. In the midst, there were some experiments. Who here knows about the Famicom Disk System? All right, we got that. Who here knows about the Disk Original group who published games for the Famicom Disk System? Those guys. And MetMag, this little platformer right here, was the one title Thinking Rabbit put out on that system. Many other Japanese PC-oriented, so home computer-oriented developers know more about that. 3 minutes, 3 seconds. And they had experiments continuing into the 90s, like this strategy RPG game, Ilvani no Shiro, and various contract work with others. But Thinking Rabbit, even with their well-regarded PC graphic text adventures, using text parser even up to a very late period, they did go into a decline in the late 90s. You can see the legacy of their success in this early horrible version, and then you can see how even their former staff went on to some interesting careers. You wouldn't think Summon Night had any connection, but the founder of Flight Plan, who made Summon Night, had first worked at Thinking Rabbit. It's funny how these leaps work out. And that goes for Takeya Iijima as well, who is kind of the underdog writer of many well-regarded cult classic JRPGs, if you ask real old heads in the Japanese RPG community. So, where do we begin? He worked at Koei for a little bit. In an interview with Den Fami, he explained that he had worked on a port of Nobunaga's Ambition to NES before leaving, distraught with how he was not making his own games. And through some clever use of the 80s bubble economy to get some easy loans and capital, he was able to start Brain Gray, make a game, and then make another game, which we have here on the left middle. It's Last Armageddon, where the whole Earth is devoid of humans who have now gone extinct, and now the demons have come back to reclaim it. And they're going to fight each other to reclaim it as it goes. You have these very epic RPG works of his, like Last Armageddon, or the dual volume Burai in the middle with character designs from the character artist behind Saint Seiya. Just an example of the kind of media crossover you had in this period. Or you have at bottom left, Gakko de Ada series, which still continues today, a visual novel series of kids, high school kids just hanging out and telling each other ghost stories. It's supposed to be gruesome, sometimes it's just weird. But in the mid-90s, even as funding became harder to get, Pandora Box and Iijima's friends were still making RPGs for the PlayStation with Pandora Max series, and then that finally fizzled out. Now these days, he does spend a lot more time with his daughter, who is an amateur golfer. He still makes games though. He still writes books about his games, novelizations, and how to make an RPG for a computer. You also have games that he worked on but isn't immediately associated with, like Emerald Dragon, a somewhat well-regarded and beloved turn of the 90s RPG on PCs, and later on Famicom, Super Famicom, and PC Engine 15. And you can see more of his work right here. On the other end, while Ijun was a young and ambitious person from the outset, then there's Kurei Eiji, which is not his real name. Kurei Eiji, he's not that crazy. Well, maybe he is. He is the oldest active games programmer in Japan. He is in his early 70s. He's made it a long way, and he started as a high school teacher who got into basic and assembly game coding in the early 80s. He started selling his games to Denpa Shimbun and BPS. Like right here on the left middle, we have Epsilon 3, which is a first-person dungeon crawler with action elements. But then he realized, I watched Zulu and the Bridge on the River Kwai growing up. I want to recreate that kind of epic experience, but how do I do it on these limited horsepower PCs of the era? That's difficult, but he managed it. With some clever programming and simplification of the AI in his games, he made something called Silver Ghost, which had a big influence on the Shining Force series. It inspired the Takahashi brothers of Camelot to go about and make their own highly cartoony, but still in-depth experience. And in these Gocha Kiara RDS/RPG hybrids, you get to play your own fighters, you can swap between combatants on the field, and you can also give orders to combatants in various ways. A big step forward from simple dungeon crawlers like Argo on the bottom left. This Gocha Kiara style was quite popular for a while. He was able to make well-regarded Gocha Kiara games for the first Queen series and for other one-off projects for a good amount of time until Windows kicked in the Windows era. As we'll see with some other creators, was difficult in transitioning from the dominant NEC PC platforms, PC88 and PC98, over to the more dominant international Windows platform. All this to say that he didn't make games for a while. He's making games now, but in the midst, he did work with other companies to produce either very small mobile games or helping out with the writing on Trails in the Sky SC. Because it turns out he can also write. He does a lot of things all by himself, even when he's working with others. And even though he did have a bout of brain cancer, he got over it. He managed to survive, and he's pushing himself now to recreate his old classic games in a format you might recognize. On the left, we have some lovely Yoshitaka Amano art of First Queen. He didn't just work on Final Fantasy. Very, very nice stuff. If you've ever seen a Japanese PC game box, many of them can be anywhere from this to this big and very bulky and filled with lots of feelies and nice things. You felt like you were getting a high quality product. One thing you wouldn't necessarily think is a high quality product if you've watched Kusoge compilations is Bokosuka Wars by Koji Sumi. And wow, you lose. No, not really. You don't lose when you play this game. You realize it's the first Japanese real-time strategy game of note. And it had a big influence on Kurei Eiji. 30 seconds. He actually responded to email questions I sent through the GPS and directly confirmed Bokosuka War's influence, among other things. He gave a really heartfelt comment on how much great military movies had inspired him to make the evolution of this style you see here. You even see it on the left right here with First Queen, The New World, which is a more modern RDS take in the vein of something like Warcraft. Also, his own 3D engine. He did a lot. Another one who did a lot is Yoshio Kiya, who here was at the Falcon panel yesterday, just out of curiosity. All right, this is the section you will probably like the most. Yoshio Kiya, the Gearhead of Legends. There's a lot to say. And the short form is, this man made Falcon. You might think of Ys and Trails as the things that make Falcon, but none of it could have happened if this one motorcycle gearhead turned programmer with an interest in Western games he played on his Apple II, thanks to Nihon Falcon being an Apple II licensed store at the time, led him to make some of the earliest Japanese RPGs for home computers. Such as on the middle left, we have a remake of Xanadu for PC98 showing the general style. The game itself would have you switch between these side-scrolling overworlds and dungeon, within the dungeon, then to shops, and then to above, top view dungeon crawling. Then you go into battles, and it's an Ultima-style real-time action type of combat system. He was mixing genres and styles of play with such abandon that you wonder how you can make it all work without everything collapsing. And there was kind of a ramshackle attitude behind his development process for a long time. You then get to games later on like Drastley Family or Legacy of the Wizard for NES, and then to Ys 3, which he actually directed once the original two director and writer of the Ys games, had themselves left to work on other projects like Illusion of Gaia. Later in his career, he also helped developers at Falcom, the few that remained after Falcom's staff exodus, develop games like Poffo Mail, Brandish, as you see at the right, that's the remake of it, before eventually heading off to Nihon Applications, where he worked on the Gekirin series of games, which are essentially kind of a culmination of Xanadu, Brandish, and other dungeon crawlers like the very original 84 Dragon Slayer. All this to say that in addition to his coding talent, he could really pull off some miracles of his own. As you can see on this slide, he was unashamed of his influences. He got Falcom into trouble with the Ultima system, Origin Systems. That art is right out of the Ultima 3 manual. That's okay. He got new art for Sorcerian. He didn't really work on Last Imperial Prince, except to finish it up. He got very good at taking others' projects and making them happen, even in the most dire circumstances. It wasn't always so lucky for everyone else. Kazunari told me, who here has heard of the Lunar series? Who here has played the Lunar games? Awesome. Well, you usually hear that Game Hearts is the developer behind the Lunar games, but it wasn't that simple. There was another developer, a studio called Studio Alex, and Kazunori Tomi had started as their leader, designer, and coding assistant. How did this happen? Well, one day, Kazunori Tomi joined at Crystalsoft, a smaller but still kind of relevant Japanese RPG producer, and made a game called Mugen no Shinzo, which roughly translates to Heart of Phantasm or Heart of Fantasy, in 1984. This game is thought to have, there is still some urban myth about it, but thought to have influenced Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura in making Dragon Quest. The commonly cited influences in this case are Ultima and Wizardry, and this adds to that list. He did another sequel to that game, as well as his own take on the Zelda format with, at bottom left, Borphés and 5 Evil Witches. These were successful, but his ambition, it could not be contained. He had to get higher and higher. He went to Falcom. Crystalsoft didn't have the resources Falcom did. And at Falcom, he worked on games such as Sorcerian, the shooting and visual novel game hybrid Star Trader, which some might recognize for its iconic theme song, and a little thing called Dinosaur. Now I must clarify, this is important. Dinosaur, the game, has no dinosaurs. Not spoilers, there are just no dinosaurs. There are lizards, there are no dinosaurs. A very important figure is named Dinosaur, but it's a dungeon crawler, and it's very good. And the Geofront, of which we are both members, are currently working on a fan localization patch to bring Dinosaur Resurrection, the 2002 Windows remake, into English. We don't have any big news. It's being worked on. Just keep an eye out. Point is, he still kind of fell into obscurity even after big successes at these two companies. Whereas, for instance, Tetsuya Takahashi and others who will later work on the Xeno series got their start at Falcom. He did great with Lunar. Lunar went well, but then games on the PC Engine like Goldendiener are utterly unknown, which is a shame. And then finally, worst of all, you finally get things like Rainbow the Truth, an early visual novel for Windows platforms, which didn't make a dent whatsoever, despite having some nice art and writing. A big lawsuit over who had the rights to the Lunar property would land Studio Alex in deep financial big doo-doo. And so the story goes silent. The story is never silent for Tokihiro Naito. Who here has heard of Hide Light? Who here has played Hide Light? Very good. Hide Light has a checkered history of being either a pretty cool cult little game preceding Zelda, or the worst Zelda clone ever. Hide Light it's kind of in between for me. I will say though, it is influential. A lot of the games that we've been talking about so far, from Yoshio Kiya and Tomi, for instance, and even from Nintendo, like Zelda, were influenced by Namco's 1984 arcade game, The Tower of Turaga, from which Naito was Naito was a big fan of and decided he would make his own version, his own adaptation of the idea for home PCs. He added the iconic overworld idea that would itself had come from Ultima and games of its vintage. And so that really kickstarted his prominence at T&E Soft, which had up to that point mainly been making graphic text adventures and golf simulations. Golf is a big thing with T&E Soft, as I'll get into in just a bit. But once he made Hydlide and its inclement sequels, he also decided to work on a series called Runeworth, which would, instead of Hydlide's more spare and simple story progression, would have it would come with a big text manual in the hint book, and would have a lot of world building and lore to actually sink into. That was another big highlight on top of, well, not working at T&E Soft, but instead moving to companies like Spike Chunsoft, where at bottom middle right, you have Shiren the Wanderer 4 for PSP, 4 Plus, which he helped direct. And even at T&E, he still experimented with games like Undeadline, which some of you might have seen on the Sega Mega Drive Genesis. These days, he now works at M2 on coding projects, and he kind of has his nice little grin. His computer's right here. You can see a little bit of the story about how he got to be so well regarded, but also, curiously, not well regarded out west because of the 1989 ports of Hydlide to the NES, which at that point seemed woefully outdated and not good. That's not how many Japanese classic game fans see it, however, just showing the regional divide and knowledge gap we're having to face here. And at right, we have the Daiva series, which is fascinating because it was all T&E Soft made for all of 1987. Why? Because you had to make games for each major PC platform, the Famicom, and that meant 7 platforms, 7 games in the same world and general story, all playing relatively similar. It was an ambitious project, and he played a big role in making that happen. Another guy who plays a big role in things is Tada. Now, this is an all-ages panel. I'm not showing the nasty bits, but this guy made eroge, erotic games. There are a lot of adult games in terms of violence or difficult subject matter, but there was a specific subset that was very popular at the turn of the 90s, especially on PC 98. This was the erotic games market, of which Tada was trying to swim or sink. The company he worked at started as Championsoft, but they still call themselves Championsoft technically on their business forums, but Alisoft is the brand they use because games such as the Rant series happen to be their most popular. That's what their brand is. What makes Rant so different from just any CG gallery glorified into some kind of adventure game that you might find from other PC 98 eroge studios? Well, he liked RPGs, and he especially liked war games. He liked games he had played from Koei, System Soft, and even tabletop companies like Hobby Japan, who were bringing over games by Avalon Hill. And so he integrated these ideas into not just the Rant series in games such as Kichugo Rants, but also other series like Daiakuji, the Dai series with Daiakuji, or later with dungeon crawlers such as Rant's Quest. Some of these you can also play on GOG now, which is another sign that despite really rapidly changing market circumstances, companies like Alisoft were flexible and small enough to stay buoyant in the midst of all this mess. He is now semi-retired. He mostly just works as a consultant for the company. He helped make a big name. His design skills got them there, and I didn't have the text for this. I can explain though. The left right here is Toshin Toshi 2 for PC 98, which was a dungeon crawler, a very popular one that actually got a 3DS remake by Image Epoch. Who remembers Image Epoch? What? That was a great time. Those were great years. I wonder where the CEO went. Yeah. And then we have an example from the Rant series. I'm not going to delve into the politics of Rants. That is a whole other panel. But we don't have to worry about the politics of Sapporo Momoko, who came from a very interesting sector of Japanese media. She was a new wave singer for a few years, going by the moniker Rika. And while this was successful enough, and she got plenty of showtimes and a few good albums, like this one on the top right, she ended up in a different sector entirely. She became an artist and started working on computer games. And at Hardsoft, a very adult-oriented studio working on these games, She did the art for the Ayayo-san series, which has gained some cult favor recently. But she really was passionate about something called Cinema House. She had this concept as early as one of her own singles, Rika does singing Cinema House. And Welcome to the Cinema House for PC-98 was a way of essentially still technically being an erotic game, but being so light on that in an actually erotic and not exploitative way, whilst expanding on the simulation elements that you saw in some of these games. The game has you managing a company of performers who make little movies. You see that you actually do create the movies and edit them, much like EA's and Lionheart's the movies in the 2000s, which is not a common, there's nothing like it on the system. She's become something of an icon for her art, but also for her own game music, of which she had plenty of experience doing. We have some examples of her singles right here, Rika on LP. They still made LPs in the 80s, amazing. And, well, that's common knowledge. We see a big poster of Welcome to the Cinema House. And finally, we see the kinds of visual novels, the kinds of doujin group visual novels that she works on now, like Black Sheep Town. These small independent creators working outside the studio system, but still wanting to make ambitious works. They really need people like Momoko, and she more than certainly delivered. Same goes for Tinyan. Tinyan was a code monkey, a code kid. She got her start working on platforms as simple as the PC-6001, which, for comparison's sake, is like the Commodore VIC-20 compared to the Commodore 64. It's kind of a downgrade. It didn't matter. She pushed whatever system she could get her hands on. And that led to the top right. It's a little hard to see from here, but that GIF is an image, is a little bit of video from Sina, a 1986 dungeon crawler that pushed a system no one thought could do 3D into doing 3D at a fast pace. There is some real scanline trickery you can see right there. She worked at SystemSoft making games like this and helping out with others, including Puzzletopia, which was an important collection of various puzzles by Nobu Yoshigahara, who was one of the preeminent Japanese puzzle makers who has his own competition named after him in memory. You also have interesting experiments like Japan Bashing, a game all about 1980s Japan-US relations, which is quite topical. And Megaton Arms, another 3D game not for PC-88, but for PC-98 with texture mapping. You didn't need it, but it's all done in software. So if you had a fast enough PC, it would run at more than 10 frames per second, probably. It does. It's impressive. It looks better than it should. Her other career, though, led her to work with doujin creators like the group Bio 100%, who themselves have a surprisingly large influence for how utterly not known they are over here. For instance, one of the artists from Bio 100%, the one who worked on Sengoku Turb, which you see in the bottom right, the cult Dreamcast game, would end up working on, that artist worked on Tamagotchi and created the iconic Tamagotchi little characters. So this is no random person we're talking about here. Tinyan had a lot of work in the 80s and 90s, and for instance, developed unique development tools for the PC FX and its expansion card, a graphics card for the PC-98. This is really in the weeds, let me tell you. I'm trying to get that running myself, not fun. I don't have to worry about any of that with Hitoshi Yasuda. This is a very important person. Who here has heard of Record of Lodos War? There you go. That's a common thread. At the base of the common thread is Hitoshi Yasuda, who himself had already been translating a number of war games and tabletop RPGs coming from the West into Japanese. And he was a columnist, he did a lot of writing in his own. And in 1986, Comptic, he organized a role-playing session with his friends that got serialized in Comptic magazine. This was an AD&D game that formed the basis of the world of Record of Lodos War. With Ryu Mizuno, he did finally novelize these games and get them into production as games. And from that, you also get games like Swordworld PC, based itself on the tabletop system Swordworld RPG. All this connects back to Group S&E, the company he founded. They do so much work, even today, on not just games they're bringing over to the West, but also their own productions, such as the Ghost Hunter series of tabletop games and novels. We have some examples at the bottom right of one of the Ghost Hunter. Actually, we have a lot of Ghost Hunter right here. And it's also some oddities like Cyber Knight 2 for PC Engine on the very rightmost in the middle. go. Sword World is still doing pretty well to these days. And you can see that they were still trying to follow trends, but do their own unique things, such as with Monster Collection, which was a take on Magic the Gathering style card games in the mid-90s. Yasuda basically was kind of the linchpin for so many tabletop RPG and board game developers at this point. Now we have someone who's also related to not particularly tabletop RPGs, but light novels. Yasuda wrote light novels, but Yuto Ramon, he wrote light novels. Light novels are already appearing in the early 80s, back when Ramon was still just making adventure games as a college student and submitted them to Enix through their contest, and, well, they got published. They were pretty successful in their own way. So he got together with a somewhat famous programmer at the time, Kazuo Morita, who here has heard of Morita's Shogi. Exactly. It seems so niche, and yet Morita and friends had already proven with their Xevious clone Alphos for PC-88 that you can make advanced games for these PCs. Ramon decided to join and essentially create more ambitious games, such as on the bottom left, Jushin Rogus, Beast God Rogus. Some people call it a Rogus, but we won't talk about that. More to the point, he made games with incredible world-building depth, such as Digan no Maseki, Digan Magic Stone, in 1988 for various PC platforms, where you have time of day, you can get sick, you can get a job, you can do all those things, or you could try and find the medicine that will cure your wife. You have to make important choices in his games, even in stuff like Reglass, which he worked on with Morita at Random House, their company. Although he would work mainly at a separate company called Artec throughout the turn of the 90s. After that, and his successful GD Lean series, he would largely stick to just writing light novels. Not forever. He did work on another game, a space naval combat title called The Seed for ArtDink. ArtDink, that's a name. We have two examples of the lovely packaging art for Artec games from the period. Dion on the left, and Medievalton Saga for the Famicom right in the middle. Simulation is a big theme with the last guy, and it's even more so with Yoichi Yamaguchi. I'm thinking of Yuru Ramon's real name is Yuhei Yamaguchi. This guy's name is Yoichi Yamaguchi. I get confused sometimes. And this guy does not get confused. He knows exactly what he wants to do. He started at ArtDink as an artist alongside fellow developer Kazutoshi Ida, who here has heard of Doshin the Giant. Yeah, a few people know. If you know, you know. But Yamaguchi knew he had to break out as well. And even before Ida, he was already making his own company, Flip Flop. With his friends, they made games such as Primal Space, where you quite literally make your own galaxy. You make your own cosmos. You make stars, planets. You connect them. You manage the denizens and the biomes, the ecologies. You try to create a stable system. Sounds niche, but there's an appeal. At least I think there's an appeal. I've tried it. It's fun. But most importantly, he is the creator of the Atlas series of games. Essentially, imagine you're a New World explorer going from Europe to a whole new place. You think you might be in the Indies, but you think you might be a Kraken over there. I'm going to write this down on my map and send it back home to my trading company, and you run the trading company. You have to decide what the map of the New World is going to be in that series. And that has its own little economy sim and sense of discovery attached to it. All these quirky things that he worked on are kind of emblematic of ArtDink in general, but he's a real standout character among their development staff. I thought it would be proper to highlight them. As you can see right here, we have cover art for Primal Space and Neo Atlas, among others. Sim games, however, don't necessarily have to be in the style of ye olde SimCity. They can sometimes just be adventure games or space exploration in their own way. And Kotori Yoshimura understood this quite well. She basically made Technosoft the same way Yoshio Kiya made Falcom. And you wouldn't think that, but then you look at Thunder Force, which came out at the tail end of 1983, and that's on a Japanese PC. This was more advanced than anything the Famicom could do at that point, before more developers had better access to the know-how Nintendo had. So suffice to say, she knew her machine coding, and she could accomplish some incredible technical feats, as she would do with games such as Wybarn on DOS and PC-88 and other systems. And in the middle, 1987's Reviver, At this point, she was working with former ex-Technosoft people at Arcisoft, and Reviver is an interesting example of how you can take an adventure game, add some simulation of realistic elements such as sound and time of day, and incorporate that into the game structure. Reviver, right here, was the Shenmue of Japanese PC games. Thankfully, I'm not calling anything the Dark Soul of anything. This very Geiger-esque thing on the bottom left right here is an example of the kind of creative ambitions they were getting up to, including Star Cruiser. In Star Cruiser, you actually heard some music at the start before the panel opened. Star Cruiser was a very influential 1988 and then 1989 and then 1990 game where you have first-person shooter battle segments, dungeon crawling in various technological environments, and then space sim style exploration across solar systems, and you're fighting a terrorist group, and it's really involved. It takes many tens of hours, as I have learned. It's very engaging stuff, but they couldn't keep it up forever. Arcis was just as precarious as many of the other companies we've talked about, and so that leads us to their work as Cyberhead, doing things for Sony Computer Entertainment, such as developing the graphics engine for Gran Turismo and working on games like a Mega Boost. You would just think maybe Polyphony Digital did everything themselves, but they still had to work from a foundation. Yoshimura was able to provide that. And though she's not doing that today, she's not doing any glamorous programming work, she still has plans to come back to that period to create games much like she used to that would push the boundaries, or at least would deal with some cool science fiction settings. However, not so glamorous for her either. Walk 1 was one of her earliest games. It has you walking the dog and occasionally cleaning up the poo. And behind the scenes, you also get things like the excellent Prince of Persia conversions that her company Arcisoft did, some of the very best that even game creator Jordan Mechner was very interested to see recently, as well as Spin Dizzy 2 and the aforementioned work on Gran Turismo. 1 minute. We have a little, 30 seconds. We have a little section right here from a video I recently did on her game Plasma Line.
Japan's first major 3D polygon game still impresses today. Technosoft's Plasma Line first released from various Japanese games. The major achievement for the company's founding game developer, Kotori Yoshimura. After near single-handedly creating the original underplayed in 83, she then designed and programmed this 3D space racing title in a few months, after cut some ideas and concept to its time streams. Evoking Atari's Space Race and recreating today's Endless Wonder 2, the game has races other spacecrafts from the asteroid belts, a la USA Cannonball Run.
That was very hard to pull off on those early platforms. And it was one story she shared where, in fact, she took a little origami piece of paper and used that to model the very few polygons available for asteroids, just simple asteroid objects in the space. She even on Technosoft's Dole, she went to SIGGRAPH conventions in order to learn some more advanced techniques. And speaking of advanced techniques, we have a whole company called System Seicom. Back in the early 80s, when the PC-98 was just for salary people, just making business applications, Seicom and one of their top programmers, Yoshio Horimoto, had an idea. Let's make games that sell our hardware. We have these peripherals, we have a sound card, we have controllers. We make these things, how do we get people to use them? And while developers alongside him, like Mark Flint, made impressive 3D games like Zone that showed off just how much the increased clock speed and NEC chip power the PC-98 had, Horimoto led the charge with something called Märchenwelle. And Märchenwelle, my German's not good. Märchenwelle combined a progenitor to the kinds of cutscenes you see in something like Ninja Gaiden on NES with a kind of mix of Taro Draga and Proto-Zelda-isms from Hydlide back in the day, and all in this glorious 640 by 400 pixel resolution that made the PC-98 famous later on. He's probably best known, however, for something called Battle of Olympus. Who here has played Battle of Olympus on NES? Yeah, there are a few people who know. It's commonly compared to Zelda 2, and yet alongside Zelda 2, these games were building off each other and building off of Namco's Dragon Buster from the arcade in very cool ways, such as in this Greek setting. He had founded a company called Infinity at that point, and today they do They do English to Japanese localizations in abundance, as well as some little experiments on the side. As you can see here, we have a little skeleton guy, and we have his spouse, Yoshida, who did the art, you see right here on the left. Fun times, old times. And then there's weird times. Imagine if Shigesato Itoi had, for whatever reason, dropped completely out of the copywriting and games development sphere and gone undercover to make interesting edutainment JRPGs where you learn things like how to touch type, for instance. Mavis Beacon has nothing on it. And just knowing how to do logic operations in order to get to your experience points after you finish a battle. This was hardcore stuff. But he made it seem fun, even if a little weird and austere. Michiaki Tsubaki games that were published through ASCII would all come in these books. They would open them up, and then there's the floppy disk. And then the rest of it is surrounding it. It's your hint book, and it's also collecting information about things explored in those games, typing techniques, and so forth. He still has some, I don't know if for sure he has his career. He is the hardest one for me to research and find proper sources on. I do know that he was born in 1944. He had a unique experience as one of the oldest creators, probably even compared to create Eiji. And so you can see some examples of the books right here on the left and right. And some of the unique art from one of his later games, Stellar Sign. All these came out on PC 98, one Windows game. He still has his website, his portfolio site up today, but he's seemingly I can't find photos for him. I can't find photos for Horimoto, but him especially. Tsubaki is kind of my enigma. All right, if they're so cool, how can I play these games? If you have an international friendly debit or credit card, you can go to Project A. They are a subscription service that lets you play Japanese PC games or Japanese console and arcade games from these creators, at least most of these creators. You can also, there are other ways. I'm not going to discuss them. You can see just how much variety I had to go through. That was a big list of people who just have so many interesting stories and produce so many interesting experiences. So, this all wraps back into the Game Preservation Society's message, which is these things are valuable. We need infrastructure to actually itemize, preserve, and maintain the stories behind these games and the people who worked on them and the magazines that wrote about them. And my sources list, it's too long. You don't want to see my bookmarks. It is what it is. And for what it's worth, I think it's time for a little question and answer. Just raise your hands and I will try to get to you. You can check out the Game Preservation Society, please. They are always looking for donations, and supporters do get access to special newsletters and other content. You can find me at the URL right there. I do work on Twitter. I am currently working on YouTube videos about many of the games I've covered here. They're going to be covered. I'm going to cover them in a video essay style. Thank you for coming, and let's start QA. You, sir.
So I noticed on the slide for Yoshimura, one of the pictures looks like it was art for 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yes. What's that about? Well, just the same way that Yoshio Kiya has taken some, let's say, artistic privilege from Ultima 3 for those Xanadu graphics. In the earliest days of Japanese PC game software, you could get away with things like unlicensed games like 2001: A Space Odyssey. She was a big fan of those sci-fi movies, novels, and games. It is an interesting game. I wouldn't call it good, but it is an interesting relic of its period. Who else has a question to ask me? Right in the middle.
Yeah, so it seems like a common trend was like a lot of these people are planning on like getting back into it or starting to get back into it.
Right.
Is there like any change that's kind of resulted in that being more viable right now? Or
Can you repeat the last part, please?
is there like anything that's like kind of resulted in that, like some change that's like made that more viable?
So to summarize that question, since people are starting to get into, for the first time, or get back into these more obscure Japanese PC games, are there changes in the discourse in general or in the kinds of media being produced in our circles that have resulted from this? And I would say so myself. If you look at games like Valhalla the visual novel Valhalla and even World of Horror, which many compare to Macintosh aesthetics, but also to PC-98 aesthetics. These are big influences even without the context. You can go on Tumblr and see many famous images of various PC-98 visual adventure games and proto-visual novels that have gorgeous art. The art sold those games. Go figure. So for me, what I'm hoping it will happen is the context develops. There's more people will know the intricacies behind all of this, and it will inform even more interesting kinds of games developing from it. I'd love to see something that, for instance, builds off of what Tsubaki did for his own entertainment thing, and maybe it can be some kind of Frog Factions type thing, I don't know. Basically, I think it's a very exciting scene. Yes.
My question was, beyond just emulating these games or purchasing them through like Project Egg,
Right.
What helps you or just people that may be interested in provide context to how impressive a particular game is? Because sometimes you play these games, you play classically that RPS real-time strategy game. It's oh, you lose. This plays like crap, but it's different because it's different at the time.
Okay. To summarize that question, what means do I use to appreciate these games beyond maybe they're just not, beyond the fact that maybe they're not as fun or playable as I wish they were, and how does that all figure in? So in the case of Bokosuka Wars, which they brought up as an example, I actually do like Bokosuka Wars on the Sharp X1, its original platform. I just don't think it was ported particularly well to the Famicom. So looking at alternate versions of games, such as Hydlite, for instance, famously not so fun on NES, actually kind of fun on its original home, and seeing the differences there. Beyond that, many magazines and many Japanese fan sites, especially from the early internet, still remain and still have interesting stories to tell about distinct play methods, techniques, and the general vibe of when a game came out and they were going to the local store, ordering it through the mail, and it finally shows up, and yeah, that's novelty, that's nostalgia, but that's still somewhat important. That adds context in its own way. At the back.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So my question is more about the preservation aspect of everything. So while a commercially released game can be backed up through an official publisher still existing today, through a site like Project Egg, how is something like a Dojin game or something like not necessarily through a big publisher get preserved?
Okay, so that question was, given that there is more activity in republishing or re-releasing games through services like Project Egg, what does this portend for Dojin games that may not have the same commercial origin? And so a great example is with the Toho series. If you ever looked at the prices for the PC-98 Toho games, you'd probably be very scared. Don't look at those. I did. It scarred me for life. And the difficulty is just procuring versions of those games and making sure that the floppy disks aren't moldy or the CDs haven't already rotted, and then making sure that they get to a person who can at least create a personal copy that they can maintain over time. The Game Preservation Society is currently tracking only commercial games. They have discussed some plans to work with Dojin creators on a case-by-case basis, and I haven't heard any progress reports on that, but it is promising. In the meantime, there are places you can look on the Internet Archive, for instance, where you can find Dojin works as wild as the earliest RPG Maker games that won contests, such as Corpse Party, or even things like, you can go, let's just say a lot of Dojin works have been preserved, and the difficulty is just in tracking down creators, especially, respecting their wishes if they don't want to do the distribution themselves or provide materials, or if they are interested, explaining the process and how we can make this available in a way that's legally tenable and viable for the future. Does that answer your question?
Yes, perfectly.
All right.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it's possible to get the slides for your presentation somewhere online.
Yes, I will be posting the slides. I'll post them first in the discussion tab on the panel description and guidebook. And I will also post them to my Twitter account. I'll publish a public copy of the presentation itself. And that way you can just download it, use it as you wish. Are there any more? We have one last little question.
Yeah, so you mentioned briefly kind of, in addition to the games, preserving some of the journalism around the games,
right.
Write-ups and stuff like that. Is that kind of approached separately from preserving the game itself, or is this kind of one lump sum, trying to get everything around the game?
Ideally, you can combine both. If you have, for instance, when the Game Preservation Society preserved Yoshio Kiya's first PC-88 game, Galactic Wars, they had him involved in order to figure out how best to get the contents of the floppy disk properly readable, and how to preserve the copy protection scheme, which is something the Game Preservation Society tries to keep. They wanted to have the intact copy of the game, not just the one that spreads across the web. And in addition to that, they brought him in for a special presentation, did an interview with him. He hasn't gotten a documentary video yet, but as they keep getting donations and keep getting extra materials to work with, they're gonna get towards working with creators like him to make more videos, going over the life's work. It's pretty exciting stuff. All right, I think that about does it, because it is 6:30. Thank you all for coming. I hope you're having a great MAGFest. It's pretty good for me so far. Thank you.